Today's topic is brain power. Today is September 10th, 2018, and I'm Dr. Alexandra Katehakis, Clinical Director here at the Center for Healthy Sex. I want to remind you that if you have any questions, that you can always type them into the chat box and I'll answer them as best I can. Also, if you want to ask questions anonymously, you should go down to the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, and that's where your question will show up so that only I can see it, and so that your name is not made public to the general public. If you're typing in the chat box, it will be public. If you have any questions about issues around sex or sexuality or need resources in your area, feel free to call our intake line at 310-843-9902. Our intake counselors are standing by and they're free to answer questions that you have or put you together with a sexuality expert here at Center for Healthy Sex. So today's topic is sort of a funny and interesting topic. When we think about brain power, or when we think about sex, we're not really thinking about our brains so much. And the quote today comes from Marvin Dunett. And Marvin says, "The hypothalamus is one of the most important parts of the brain, involved in many kinds of motivation, among other functions. The hypothalamus controls the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeling, and mating." So he was discreet about the final F word, but I think you can put that together. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how you can use your brain to be discerning, to make good choices about sex and sexuality. So for starters, we've all heard this phrase, use it or lose it. And I think use it or lose it probably came around, I don't know, maybe in the 1980s when we were talking about exercise. You had to start exercising, otherwise if you didn't use it, you would lose it, meaning muscle tension, muscle mass, strength, flexibility, and cardiovascular endurance. But this is important, now we know, for all of our organs, certainly our brains and our genitals. In fact, neuroscientists tell us that we should learn something new every year as we age in order to keep our brains facile and so that we're challenging it, because it in some ways is a muscle like every other muscle in the body. And back to, I think this is true also for our genitals, that if we don't have sex as we age, we don't want sex. So the more you have it, the more you want it, because you start to forget about it just like any other thing. It's like if you're not lifting weights or going for long walks or hiking or challenging yourself physically, at some point you'll just say, well, I can't do that anymore. So you're really succumbing to gravity and atrophy, I would say. So the challenge, I think now, with all reports for aging today, is not that we're going to be immortal. We're all going to die, but it's about a quality of life as we're along the way to that. Are we still mobile? Do we still have an experience of our sexuality, which doesn't necessarily mean intercourse, but it does mean a sensuality, a full body experience of who we are as sexual beings. So the hypothalamus is considered one of the major connectors between the brain and the body. And it motivates us, as our quote said, into all sorts of actions, including sex. And that's one of the reasons that we refer to the brain as the biggest sex organ in the body, because arousal definitely starts in the brain. And it's in our imagination that we can have sex and a multitude of sexual experiences without ever actually having those experiences. But our brain gets aroused very quickly, and it gets aroused more quickly than the genitals do. So when we see people that excite us or images that excite us, we create a mental sexual template, and signals go through our hypothalamus down into our genitals. So even though we've taken in the data, our brains are ignited seconds and sometimes minutes before we are genitally aroused. And it's important for us to really think about discretion when it comes to how many images we're taking in, and what sexual situations we enter. So in other words, we're using our brain power or our erotic intelligence, if you will, that we're really considering these sexual situations with the skilled use of reason. So we want to keep our prefrontal cortex online, which is our higher cortical functions, the thinking, reasoning part of our brain online, so that we're not just being run by this lower brain, the limbic brain, which is much more excitatory and emotional, and even impulsive. If it's not regulated from on high. So that's where I think discernment comes in. And I think, I've talked about this before, that there's something very powerful when we own our sexuality rather than our sexuality owning us. Because if you're owned by your sexuality, it's like being owned by your appetite. There's no impulse control there. There's no discernment. There aren't choices that are being made. We're just sort of these unruly creatures kind of doing whatever comes our way. And, eventually without moderation, that does make us sick, whether it's drugs, food, alcohol, or sex. We are going to get involved in excess. And then excess does not make us feel good, nor does it feel particularly sexy. And people report feeling out of control. And when you're out of control, you certainly are not owning your sexuality. It is owning you. So I want you to think about then what good brain power or what good impulse control does for you in relation to these matters, and how you can more enjoy sensuality and beauty all day long in a way that's not overtaxing to the system by abusing your brain-body connection. So that goes back to something I said earlier, that people often consider that sex is some sort of penetrative experience. And sex and sexuality, first of all, sexuality is sort of the sum total of who you are, how you imagine yourself in sexual situations. And so when you think about, well, what really does turn me on? What arouses me? What do I like? What don't I like? That's when you're using your brain power. You're not just being sort of caught off guard or acting something out on a whim. And that's not to say that, sex should be completely buttoned down and super reasonable and organized. That sounds very rigid and boring. I'm not saying that. I'm asking you to hold the paradox of sort of unbridled excitatory arousal with skillful choices along the way. So it's like, sometimes I think about putting a child in a playpen. You're not saying you can't play and you can't do all sorts of silly things and stand upside down and play with your creatures and animals in your playpen. But by having that containment, the child doesn't get lost or scared or start, getting involved in things that are going to be hurtful. The parameters or the boundaries have been chosen, and then all the goodies get to go inside the chosen parameters. So think about using your brain power in that way. So if you've just joined us, I want to remind you that you can ask me questions by texting in the text box, or if you want to remain anonymous, you can go into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, where I can see your messages without anybody else who's on the webinar being able to see them also. So one of the ways we want to be discerning, and one of the ways I think we want to cultivate a good sexuality, when I mean good, I mean resilient, elastic, robust, a place where you don't feel like you've been damaged by or shamed by or seen sexual images you wish you hadn't seen, is by not looking at excessive sexual images or letting all types of sex sort of run rampant through our minds and being impulsive, because again, it lacks discernment and possibility. And then your brain gets fixated on one way of being sexual. And I think that's extremely limiting. I think if the only way you can be sexual is by some image you saw once upon a time in pornography, and you're always looking for that same image or that same person, then you really have to ask yourself about how limited and rigid you start to get. And so it would be like saying, I only wear one kind of shoes, and I'm not interested in looking at other kind of shoes. And yet you're wearing something that's sort of old and falling apart, or worse yet, they're bad for your feet, and you're not willing to look at the new technology and possibility supports and colors because to think God. That's imaginative, not very fun sexuality. And the opposite of that would be having so many pairs of shoes, you just don't know what to wear, nor do you think a new pair of shoes is particularly novel. And I'm asking you to consider really being in the middle ground, because we don't want to create sexual problems that deprive us of sexual energy, or deprive us of attraction to real live human beings. My quest or my desire for all of us is that we have enough space in our head that we're open to possibility, we're open to learning, we're open to experimentation, because we haven't so boxed ourselves in either by way of deprivation and too little experience, or by excess and too much experience. Because, for example, too much internet pornography for some people has them overtaxing their brain to the extent that they're really not comfortable with real people in real time. And I do have a bias that I'll just own here, that I think that creates deprivation of touch. I mean, the skin is the biggest organ in the body. We have so many nerve endings in our skin, and that desire to be touched, that feeling of being touched, can be so incredibly sensual and so deeply and profoundly arousing before genital contact is ever made. But if you're so used to dialing your brain into one way of seeing sex and sexuality, then touch is one example of an erogenous zone that you will have forgotten about. Another one is taste and scent. What does it mean for you to taste your lover's skin or their bodily fluids, to taste the sweetness of their breath, to be in close proximity with scent, whether it's the scent of someone's skin or a scent that they wear, or the smell of their hair, because natural scent and pheromones are very excitatory to the brain. Christine writes, what would you recommend for therapists working with people suffering from the need for pornographic novelty? What's the brain's path back for them? And how can therapists not fully trained in addiction or sex therapy presumably work with this? Well, I would say that there is tons of material now on the internet, and certainly in peer-reviewed journal articles and research, that show that these same areas of the brain that are seeking novelty in pornography can also start to get dulled as a result of too much. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you do too much of it, the novelty wears off. And so I would say that if you have people that are looking at pornography over and over again, and they're seeking novelty, you first want to just check in with them to find out how their sex life is outside of masturbation and isolation. And are they interested in being sexual with other people, or are they happy with that kind of isolation? Because if they are, and they continue down that path, that's likely going to be the only form of sex and sexuality they have. And I would argue that that person is, rather avoidant and probably has deeper psychological issues. So I would talk about excessive novelty. I read an article recently because, Burning Man just ended, and there was a woman talking about how she'd been going to Burning Man for so long, she'd gotten burned out from Burning Man. She'd been going for 10 years or something. And she realized what she really needed was a break from the burn, that she needed a year off because she'd gotten so jaded about thinking, oh, there's that art installation, or there's that person and their music. And it was no longer novel and fantastic and exciting for her. So she went on a burn break, or you could say burn diet. And I think that's what people that are looking at excessive pornography need also. It's like, put yourself on a porn diet, just turn it off. Turn it off for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. You're not going to die without it. And see what your body does, and start to notice whether you are even interested in other people, or if you see other flesh and blood people as arousing to you? And if not, it's probably because your brain's kind of tired. There is a phenomenon called neuronal fatigue where the neurons get exhausted because of too much stimulation. And so just shutting it down, and that would be true for people that are on diets. You know, a lot of people just stop eating bread. Doesn't mean you have to stop eating bread your whole life, but cutting out those kind of simple carbs that have so much sugar in them, just that act can have people dropping 5-10 pounds. So you see that our body gets, and our brains get highly habituated to something. And when we're doing them over and over again, there is no novelty to it. And the body and the brain hit sort of a set point with it. So I would say, first and foremost, go on a porn diet. And that allows the brain and the nervous system to start to recalibrate itself, and hopefully to start calibrating to another person if that's what they're looking for. And I think with therapists who aren't fully trained in sex addiction or sex therapy, it's good to educate yourself by taking some classes, whether they're in real time or online. There's a lot of material about the effects of pornography on the brain online. All you have to do is Google that. I mean, you can look at Gary Wilson's videos called Your Brain on Porn. You can look at some of the sites that have been put up by people such as Gabe Deem, who has a site called Reboot Nation, and Alexander Rhodes, who has a site on Reddit called NoFap. And there, people, your clients, can start to look at what effect internet pornography has on people's brains. And those resources are not necessarily from science, they're from lay people who say, I have had this experience. And when you've got 4,000 or 5,000 young men online saying, I'm having this experience, then you can start to see that you're not alone with the experience. And it's not a bunch of experts who are saying, this is definitely a problem as we see it. It's just people telling people that I've had this experience and they can relate to it. So somebody asked me to type these in real quickly. So I'm doing that. And let's see, this is the last one. And if you Google these, you'll be able to find them. I don't have the URLs in my head, but you can easily find these things. So if anybody has any other questions related to that, please feel free to chime in now. So I think what I was saying is, when you let sexual images and sexual thoughts run rampant in your mind, you start to deprive yourself, I think, of your true sexual energy, and your attraction can create another problem. Because if you don't use your genitals, meaning you're not having regular sexual contact with other people, then it might be harder for you to get aroused by actual sex. So this isn't just about genital arousal, which is what we see in pornography. It's also about pleasure. And so what about pleasure? How do you get sexual pleasure? Is it just from masturbatory activity, so it's just about getting off? Or is it a shared pleasure state with someone else, another flesh and blood human being, so that you're starting to get that arousal and that connection through eyeball-to-eyeball contact and body-to-body contact. So I don't want this to be misconstrued in any way, shape, or form that I'm negating pornography or negating pleasure by way of porn. I'm not. I'm just saying that if you do something too much in any extreme, you're going to miss something else out on the other side. And so can you use your sexuality as a form of pleasure with another person, as opposed to strictly with electronic forms? So again, this is about being discerning, using your discretion for how you want to expend your sexual energy. Because look, face it, if you're masturbating to pornography, then you're probably not going to be as likely to engage your partner sexually because you're not horny. You don't want sex. You've already, just relieved yourself in that way. And that's a good way to also avoid relationship, to kind of stay away from people, to stay isolated, or not have to deal with perhaps a relationship or marriage that you feel is not going so well, because it's an effort to reignite sexual activity and energy between two people if you've set it aside. You've got to talk through all your difficulties. You've got to deal with the challenges you have about your lack of attraction, perhaps, to their body, or your anger at them or your resentment. And likewise, they have to be honest with you about why their attraction to you has tanked. So it's the long way, it's the slower way, but it does pay off different dividends than the quick way does, which is simply flipping open your laptop and looking at images all the time. So I think it's a good idea to remember that your body is your temple. So don't deny yourself pleasure. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. And just like we don't want to be putting, toxic chemicals into your body or eating processed foods that are going to make you sick repeatedly, you don't want to put things into your brain that are going to calibrate your brain in a direction you may not want to go in. So I can see that someone from CHS typed in the actual URLs to these different sites I was talking about. So you should see those in the chat box. So does anybody have any other questions about brain power? And maybe how it relates to your relationship or to your use of pornography or your fear of sex and sexuality? Because I know we have people online listening right now. So another thing to consider is, are you being, well, here's a note right here from someone. It says, how do you exercise your prefrontal cortex if you've been diagnosed as a sex addict? Well, I think that's not that difficult. If somebody is, first of all, I just want to be clear that, sex addiction is not yet a bona fide diagnosis, although sexual compulsivity has been recognized by a major organization in the world. And so it is moving closer to a diagnosis, but nonetheless, just to be clear about that, sex addiction, as I see it, is a syndrome or a constellation of behaviors, and it's really symptomatic of deeper issues. And part of the problem is the person is so focused on sex and preoccupied by sex, really almost 24/7, that they're no longer present in their life, and they are in a state of really moderate dissociation where they're in fantasy all the time, or they're getting into the sexual act, or they're cleaning up all the lies and secrets they have. So they're using their brain power in maladaptive ways. And one of the reasons the sex addiction model asks people to stop all of the activities they've been engaged in that are creating problems is so that their brain can start to heal. So they can start to look at the habit, really, of every time I feel happy, sad, mad, glad, joyous, excitatory, or angry, all I do is reach for sex. All I do is look for orgasm. All I look is for distraction online. And when you take all those things away from people, the question is, how are you going to use your prefrontal cortex? What other activities can you engage in? That's why there are sayings in the program like taking contrary action. And also, quote, fake it till you make it. Start to use other resources as opposed to the impulsive ones, the sexual ones, to start to regulate yourself. So that would mean making a phone call to somebody and talking about being upset, hurt, or angry instead of just masturbating those feelings away. Or going perhaps to a 12-step meeting, or joining friends for breakfast or coffee and talking about what's going on instead of isolating all of that and compartmentalizing it and hiding it out. So there is an adage in the program also that recovery is simple but not easy. This is not rocket science, but dedicating oneself to reading recovery literature, to doing all the exercises that are asked of people, all the inventories, the step work, the fellowship that a program or group therapy or therapy provides is a way of activating the prefrontal cortex and getting the person to stay in reality instead of drifting off into fantasy and dissociative states. So I hope that answers your question. You know, often people say, well, sex addiction, that term is an excuse for behaving badly, or this idea that somebody's out of control is ridiculous. You can control yourself. And what's missing in that is really an understanding of the neuroscience underneath what happens to people when they habituate anything and it becomes problematic. And we call that chronic habituation addiction in our culture. It means a strong predilection for something where people are doing something over and over and over again, and it's creating messes or unmanageability in their lives. And if you ask those people that identify as addicts of any stripe, they will tell you that they feel like they've got a monkey on their back, that they feel like they can't stop doing it, and they certainly can't stop doing it by themselves. And that's one of the magical and interesting things about recovery. The minute somebody tells the truth about what's going on, the minute they can say, this is really shameful and I'm really afraid to say what's truthful for me, that's the minute, the second they start healing, because the shame starts to melt away. And they start to see that other people struggle with the same things, that all of us have had dirty little secrets in our lives. None of us are perfect. And they're not alone in this problem. So it's with that that the healing starts to happen quite quickly and shame starts to get reduced very quickly. Do you think those with attachment issues are more predisposed to chronic habituated sexual behavior? And I would say yes. That's one of the premises of my last book called Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, that I believe when early infantile attachment processes are stunted or breached repeatedly, that the infant turns into a child who cannot regulate him or herself, meaning they can't manage their emotions, they can't soothe themselves down. So they either have high anxiety, perhaps extremely high anxiety, or their system is just down. They're so dissociated, they don't know what they're feeling in their body. And so they start to seek experiences that either manage the anxiety to make that feeling kind of go away or get lower, or get themselves up out of a dead state because they feel so depressed or, quote, dead at the core of who they are. And so these sexual experiences are kind of a way to jumpstart the brain and the nervous system over and over and over again. And what may start out fairly innocently in childhood or adolescence starts to become, I would dare say, monstrous for many in adulthood, where people get married while they're still acting out sexually, and their partners never know it going into the marriage. So the entire time they're still cheating, they're still chatting, they're still looking, they're still, masturbating to porn compulsively. And the person who's gotten involved with that dysregulated person who's got an insecure attachment has no idea that that's going on in the background. And that can be incredibly challenging to be in a relationship with somebody where something's just not quite right and you can't put your finger on it. And you can't put your finger on it because there's no bottle to point to. There's no excessive marijuana use to point to or drug usage. So this is a setup, I think, for addicts of all types, and it really depends on what was going on in the family of origin. Also, if there's a history of either sex, drug, or alcohol abuse in the family, the person who is not getting what they want and need, predominantly what they need in early infancy and childhood, is going to gravitate towards the addiction a parent or a family member had. So if you are honest with yourself today and you really look at your sexual habits and assess whether you're out of control with sexual behaviors or whether you're ignoring your sexuality, that's going to give you information about where you should be and what you should be doing if you want to have a healthy sex life. So it's not just about either being out of control. What about all of the people and all of us who neglect our sex lives, who don't really pay it much attention? I was teaching a class this weekend in Arlington, Virginia, to therapists, a sex therapy class, and we were talking about this group of therapists, how sex gets marginalized so easily. we get lazy about a sex life and a long-term committed relationship. People are more inclined to maybe watch their dog on the weekend, or take their car to the car wash, or run errands, or do any number of other things, but approach their partner because it feels like too much work. Because people are tired, or their bodies are sluggish for some ways, or they've stopped seeing themselves as sexual beings. So where is the way that you neglect your sexuality? So I want to invite you today or this week to really look at your sexual habits. Somebody says erotic intelligence has some of this content as well. Just started the book, but highly recommend it. Thank you. I think that book does have a lot of the information that we're talking about here, and a lot of questions and exercises that help people really challenge themselves about what sex means to them and what the messages are that they got from childhood. And the notion of erotic intelligence is helping you use your brain power to make these skilled decisions about the kind of sex you want to have. So somebody wrote to me about sex addiction versus fetishes, if I have any thoughts about that. If I ask my wife for an open marriage as an addict, is that acting out? And the answer is no. So those are two different things. Okay, so sex addiction versus fetishes. Today, I would say many, many, many people have fetishes. We also call those kink. And people have become more kink aware now with the advent of 50 Shades of Grey and all the internet pornography that's opened us to a wide world of sex and sexuality. So if there is something that is particularly arousing to you, you have to come out of the shame you have about what that thing is and start to be honest with yourself that that thing is arousing to you. And whatever that thing is, I want to talk about something that's not too triggering, but let's say I'm looking at the keys on my desk. Let's say I've got a thing for keys, and I think keys are really hot, and I want my partner to wear a keychain when we're having sex. As I'm saying this, there probably is a fetish for keys. But if I feel shameful about it, if I feel like it's wrong or it's dirty, then I'm never going to tell my partner about this. And I'm going to start secretly stashing keys or looking at pornography where people have keys. And then that split and that divide starts to get bigger and bigger. And so really what the challenge is, and this is the challenge in erotic intelligence also, is to get really honest with yourself. First of all, to investigate, where did I get that fetish for keys from? Was I sexually abused with a key? Did I see my parent using keys all the time before they had sex and I thought that was exciting? Or maybe it's just, I have no idea where it came from and it doesn't even matter to me. I just know that I like it and it's not hurting anybody else and it's not weird or freaky. So I really want that object in my sex life. The next thing I have to do is sit down with my sexual partners and say, hi, I have this thing that really turns me on. Are you open to hearing it? And if your partner says yes, another part of that is saying, are you open to hearing it without shaming me? Can you tolerate your own discomfort at hearing it and not make it about me or use it against me? And that's where we all have to hold on to ourselves and manage our own anxieties and really hear our partners without rolling our eyes or saying that's disgusting or you're a freak or shaming the other person. So if somebody, if I was the person who was, enjoying the key fetish, and I told my partner about that, and I was the partner, let's say, receiving that, I would have to say, wow, I'm really surprised to hear this because I never knew this about you. So I'm a little jarred because we've been married for 15 years and I had no idea. And I might ask a lot of questions about it. Like, when did you get this key fetish? Have you used keys with other people besides me? And gather information about it and then find out more about what my partner liked about it and what they wanted to do about it. And then I have to ask myself, is that really so out there for me and so unusual that I can't try it? And what's my aversion to trying it? And is it just because I'm so closed-minded, I'm just saying, no, I'm never doing that? Or is it because I'm afraid to see myself as someone who's a little kinky? I'm afraid about what that means about me. Like, what if my mother knew I liked keys, or my sister found out about it? We start to go into all of these other places as a way to not deal with our own discomfort about our own sexuality. And so as an adult, if a key in my sex life is not violating my integrity some way or making me feel really dirty or humiliated, then I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say, you know what, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try it because it's super arousing to you, which is only going to make sex better for me. And it's unusual, and I'm going to be open to being aroused by this idea also. And maybe I'm aroused by it, maybe I'm not. Maybe I think it's hilariously funny. I don't know what my experience is going to be of it, but I'm going to be willing to talk about it. And also, obviously, with an object like a key, I'm going to be wanting to talk about safety and not being hurt and not having my skin punctured, because I personally wouldn't be into that. I'd want to know how the object is being used. So these are the kind of conversations we have to be in as adults to start to mitigate shame. Now, the question was sex addiction versus fetishes. There are plenty of people who have kink and fetish that are sex addicts, and plenty who are not. So just because you have a kink or a fetish does not make you an addict. And really, the litmus test there is the level of compulsivity. If somebody is compulsively using keys, they can only have sex with keys, they can't do it any other way, they're having lots and lots of partners and they're doing it without their partner knowing it, they're cheating excessively, that's really sexual addiction and compulsivity. So we really want to help the person stop the compulsive behaviors. We're going to put the key aside, and then once they start to get treatment and start to feel better and they're healthier in their use of sex and sexuality, we want to start to fold the key, the quote fetish or kink, back into their sexuality in a way that's non-compulsive, that aligns with their values. And now, that said, there are people that say, you know what, I can never do that again because I was so compulsive with that, let's say the key, that just seeing a key is so triggering for me, I'm going to start cheating again, and I just don't want to do that, and I don't want that in my life. But that's up to the client and up to the person in recovery and the couple in recovery. So this question also, if I want an open marriage, is that acting out? The answer is no. And again, negotiating consensual non-monogamy is a whole other enchilada. I don't know why enchiladas get to be the whole thing, but that is a conversation about who we are as a couple, what we want, what the contracts are going to be, how we're going to negotiate this. And a lot of conversation, I think, with a skilled therapist, a lot of contracts and a lot of agreements have to be set in place so that can work well for each other. But again, it's where is the compulsive piece in all of this? That's what the person who's in recovery has to look out for. And so if somebody writes, so if I want, quote, toys in my playpen, as long as my spouse can see the toys and I'm not playing with them secretly, that's acceptable. I would say yes. And I would guess communication is, quote, the key, pun intended. And I would say yes, it is. Whatever those toys are that you want in your playpen, I think it's important to talk to your partner about it and to be in an open conversation, and also to trust you may not get what you want. You may be disappointed, but there has to be a way to at least have the conversation about what you want and what you're interested in, so that you can go forward as a couple. So someone writes, I love how you speak of how this applies to all of us and not as though therapists are just helping others with these issues. Yeah, therapists, are people. Therapists have sex. Therapists have sexual issues. The dirty little secret with sex therapists oftentimes is that they're not having sex. And I've talked about this with sex therapy colleagues, or sex therapist colleagues and educators as well. So it's like the mechanic whose car is breaking down all the time. So it's important to say that all of us struggle with issues of sex and sexuality over a lifetime because we're all human beings. What do you recommend for therapists that would like to take that humanistic, inclusive approach? Well, I'm comfortable within other areas. It seems trickier while talking about sexuality. So I'm not sure what you mean about that, a humanistic, inclusive approach. I would say that to be able to, first of all, really know what your sexual issues are, your sexual limitations are, your sexual preferences, your sexual biases and limitations and judgments are crucial if you're going to talk to people about sex and sexuality. Because what that does is it allows you to create a non-judgmental, non-shaming environment that telegraphs to your clients that they can talk about anything with you, and that you're not going to have some judgment about it. And just because I may not be into something sexually does not mean that the person shouldn't do it. I mean, that's just so ridiculously limiting. If somebody is into something sexual that I'm not into, I want to be curious about their experience. Look, it would be no different if somebody said, I want to, take a backpack and go hiking through Death Valley in the summer. And I think that would probably be one of the most atrocious vacations I could imagine, because I couldn't bear the heat. It's not that I wouldn't love the hike, but the thought of it just sounds to me like, like self-abusive, and why would you want to do that? Like, there are all sorts of judgments that can come flooding in. As opposed to saying, you know what, this body at this point in my life couldn't endure that kind of pressure and that kind of heat, but that body could. So let me find out where this person got that idea from, why they like the idea, who else might be going with them, who knows about it, how they're going to stay hydrated, do they have, a doctor advising them? Like, get super curious about why they like that and where the line is for them between pushing their endurance versus self-harm and deprivation. So I would say that you talk about sex and sexuality from what you're calling a humanistic perspective by being as curious and non-judgmental as you possibly can be, and then always to seek consultation, because these can be very triggering conversations. So someone says, going back to your key example, if I keep that as a secret and it grows to the point of crossing values and boundaries, but finally comes out in disclosure, when does one begin to explore and peel back that onion? Well, I would say after your disclosure process and after your partner has feels that they can really trust you again. Because you can't just go from A to Z without going through all the other letters of the alphabet. And oftentimes partners are particularly triggered and activated by a certain sexual act because they equate that with the addictive behavior, but more importantly, with the gross betrayal that goes with the addiction. So I think you have to take it very slowly, and you have to have a lot of sobriety and recovery yourself, and you have to be using your brain power every day to help your partner heal from the betrayal. So you have to exercise a lot of empathy and compassion for where he or she is coming from in terms of their skittishness about being sexual again, much less wading into the waters of sexuality that is more erotic, if you will. And that's one of the reasons that erotic intelligence was broken down into all these simple steps of healthy sex, intimate sex, erotic sex, and spiritual sex, because these are developmental stages and they can take a really long time. Someone says, I've not had sexual contact with a partner for about 2.5 years due to going through a divorce and recovering from that relationship and the loss of it. I've been quite successfully working through some love addiction issues, and I now have a bit of a double bind situation, being torn between the real need for sexual activity with a partner and the recognition that perhaps sexual contact with a person I'm not emotionally attracted to may be inviting a triggering or simply unhelpful situation into my life, mistaking the sex with them for true intimacy or love. I've only recently decided to start dating, and I don't intend to have sex with someone while early in the relationship and just getting to know them. What do you recommend for someone needing sexual interaction but do not have a partner available to them at this time? Well, I would say a good vibrator is the answer to that question. And I don't mean that facetiously. What I appreciate in what you're saying, especially for love addicts and especially for, well, I guess gender doesn't really matter, but I know for female sex addicts or love addicts that it's very easy for women to fall in love once they have intercourse with a male, because the amount of neurochemicals that are released after intercourse, predominantly oxytocin, which is our primary neurochemical of trust and bonding and ultimately love, is extremely powerful. So I once had a woman say to me that once a guy's inside me, I'm in love with him. And while that was really sort of a colloquialism or a folk wisdom, there's something incredibly true from that perspective neuroscientifically. And so if you know that being sexual with somebody means that you're going to be your boundaries are going to get diffuse. You're going to start seeing them in a way that may not be using your prefrontal cortex, staying in reality, that you start to drift and really get dissociative and start to be in fantasy about that person, then you do want to slow things down. And that's why a dating plan is important. And I would also recommend that you date more than one person at a time, maybe two people at a time, so that you're noticing how they show up for you. Do they call you when they say they're going to call you? Do they follow through on the things they're going to say, so that you're in reality about who they are? And in the meantime, get a good personal vibrator so that you can enjoy sexual pleasure yourself, so that you're not so desperate to be sexual because you're satisfying that need on your own. And those are ways of using your brain power and exercising discernment and discretion when it comes to your sexuality. So don't deny yourself sexual pleasure. Use it or lose it, I said before. And make sure that you share your fears with your partner, and that you are honest about the things that you think turn you on, and maybe you don't even know turn you on, but you want to kind of run it by your partner and say, hey, what would you think about this? Or what's your judgment of me if I tell you that this is really appealing to me? Risk knowing who you are and then communicating it effectively with your client, with your partner, rather, not your clients, with your partners, because we were talking about therapists as well. And take a time to think today about your sexual habits and whether you're using your brain power towards your sexual pleasure. So thank you for this conversation today. I'm Alex Katehakis, Clinical Director of Center for Healthy Sex, and you can reach us at centerforhealthysex.com, or you can go to our intake line 310-842-5093, where our intake therapists and counselors are available to talk to you if you have any questions about this topic. I look forward to seeing you all next month, and have a good September.